this episode, we're going to take a security policy from something that sounds authoritative on paper and turn it into something that actually fits how an organization chooses to live with risk. A lot of policy failures happen because the words are technically correct but emotionally impossible, meaning the organization cannot or will not behave the way the policy demands when real deadlines and real trade-offs arrive. The missing link is alignment, which is the practice of making policy match risk appetite, making exceptions possible without turning into loopholes, and making accountability clear enough that the policy operates in daylight rather than through informal favors. When those pieces are misaligned, policies either get ignored, or they get followed only when an audit is nearby, or they get enforced unevenly, which is often worse than not enforcing at all. The goal today is to help you understand how leaders connect a policy to what the organization is willing to tolerate, how they manage deviations without losing control, and how they build accountability mechanisms that keep the policy real over time. A practical way to start is to define risk appetite in plain language, because beginners often hear the term and assume it is a complicated financial calculation. Risk appetite, RA, is the amount and type of risk an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its goals, and it is not the same as being reckless or being fearful. It is a decision about trade-offs, like how much disruption the business can tolerate, how much data exposure would be unacceptable, and how much friction is acceptable in workflows to reduce risk. RA is usually shaped by factors like the organization's industry, the sensitivity of its data, contractual obligations, customer expectations, and the consequences of downtime or breaches. The important point is that RA is not just a leadership slogan. It is a set of boundaries that should influence what policies require and how strict those requirements are. When policy writers ignore RA, they often create rules that are either too strict to follow consistently or too weak to matter, and both outcomes produce a false sense of security. Aligning policy with RA is how you avoid writing rules that your own organization will quietly break. Once you accept that RA shapes what is realistic, you can see why policy alignment is not a one-time writing exercise, but a governance practice that connects decisions across many teams. A policy often speaks in broad terms, like requiring strong access controls, protecting sensitive data, or reviewing changes, yet each of those requirements can be interpreted in multiple ways. One organization might accept slower deployment and stricter approval gates because it prioritizes stability, while another might accept more automation and faster changes because speed is part of the business model, even if that introduces different kinds of risk. Alignment means translating RA into policy language that is clear about what outcomes are mandatory and where flexibility exists. It also means being explicit about how different classes of systems and data are treated, because RA is rarely uniform across everything. An organization might accept more risk for a low-impact internal tool than for a customer-facing system that processes personal data. When policies reflect those distinctions, teams can follow them without constant conflict, and auditors can see that the organization is making deliberate choices rather than accidental compromises. A useful mental model is to think of policy as a contract between the organization and itself, where the organization promises to behave in certain ways because it believes those behaviors are worth the cost. If the promised behaviors exceed the organization's willingness to pay in time, money, and friction, then the contract will be violated in practice, even if nobody says so out loud. This is why our aim must be reflected not only in what a policy demands, but also in the way the policy describes priorities and escalation. For example, a policy might require that certain changes undergo review, but alignment means clarifying which changes are high risk enough to require stronger controls and which changes can be handled through lighter mechanisms. This prevents the policy from creating a bottleneck that teams will bypass under pressure. Alignment also means acknowledging that security is a risk management function, not a purity test, so policies should drive consistent outcomes rather than attempt to eliminate all risk. Beginners sometimes assume that stricter policy automatically means better security, but a policy that is strict and ignored is weaker than a policy that is balanced and consistently followed. The goal is consistent behavior that matches the organization's chosen tolerance for risk. Exceptions are the next major concept because even a well-aligned policy will face situations where a requirement cannot be met immediately, and those situations must be handled openly. An exception is a documented decision to deviate from a policy requirement for a specific reason in a specific period, and it exists to prevent informal workarounds. Beginners sometimes view exceptions as failures, but exceptions can be a sign of maturity when they are controlled, because they show the organization can be honest about constraints while still managing risk. The danger is exception sprawl, where exceptions become the normal way of operating and the policy becomes an optional suggestion. This happens when exceptions are easy to request, hard to deny, and rarely reviewed, which turns them into permanent loopholes. Aligning policy with exceptions means building an exception process that is strict enough to preserve the policy's integrity and flexible enough to keep business moving. It also means defining what information must be included, like the reason for the exception, the data or systems affected, the duration, and the safeguards that reduce risk during the exception period. When exceptions are structured, the organization can accept temporary risk without losing long-term control. A critical part of exception alignment is understanding compensating controls, because an exception should rarely mean doing nothing in place of the required control. Compensating controls are alternative safeguards that reduce risk when the primary requirement cannot be met, such as tighter access scope, additional monitoring, limited time windows, or manual verification steps. The purpose is to keep the risk within the organization's RA even when the standard approach is not possible. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking an exception is a free pass, when in reality an exception is a risk trade, and trades must be justified. This is also where expiration becomes essential, because exceptions should end unless they are deliberately renewed with fresh reasoning. Without expiration, exceptions become invisible debt, and debt accumulates until the organization no longer knows which parts of the environment are operating outside policy. Aligning policy with exceptions means making renewal intentional, which often includes reassessing whether the exception is still necessary and whether the compensating controls are still effective. Over time, exception patterns also become valuable feedback, because repeated exceptions on the same requirement often signal that the policy is misaligned with real workflows or that the organization needs better support to meet the requirement. Accountability mechanisms are the third part of the title, and they are what turn a policy from a statement of intent into an operating system. Accountability means someone is responsible for ensuring the policy is implemented and maintained, and it also means there are consequences for ignoring it, not necessarily punitive consequences, but corrective consequences that restore intended outcomes. A common failure is writing policies that sound strict but have no owner, no enforcement path, and no routine for measuring compliance. In that situation, compliance becomes a matter of personal preference, and personal preference varies widely across teams. Accountability mechanisms include ownership of the policy itself, ownership of the controls that implement it, and ownership of the review processes that confirm it is being followed. They also include clear decision rights, meaning who can approve exceptions, who can accept risk, and who can enforce remediation when controls drift. When accountability is unclear, decisions get delayed, risk acceptance happens informally, and enforcement becomes inconsistent. Aligning policy with accountability means designing roles and routines so that policy requirements are not just written but actively managed, reviewed, and corrected over time. One of the simplest ways to make accountability real is to explicitly assign responsibilities and decision rights in a way that matches how work is actually organized. Many organizations use a responsibility mapping model like responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, or ACI, to clarify who does the work, who owns the outcome, who provides input, and who must be notified. The specific model matters less than the clarity it creates, because clarity prevents the common situation where everyone thinks someone else is handling the important parts. Accountability also needs to exist at multiple layers, because one person might own a policy area, another team might own the technical controls, and a different group might own the audit evidence and reporting. Alignment means those responsibilities fit together without gaps, and it also means the people assigned actually have the authority and resources to fulfill the role. A beginner trap is assigning accountability to roles that do not have practical control, which creates paper accountability without real ability to act. When accountability is matched to authority, Policy enforcement becomes fairer because decisions are made by the right people rather than by whoever happens to be available. That fairness is one of the strongest drivers of consistent compliance. Accountability mechanisms also include measurement, because without measurement, leadership cannot tell whether the policy is being followed or whether it is slowly drifting into irrelevance. Measurement should focus on decision-ready indicators rather than vanity numbers, meaning metrics that help you decide what to fix and where to invest. Organizations often use key risk indicator, KRI, metrics to track risk signals, like the number of public-facing storage resources or the count of overdue access reviews, and key performance indicator, KPI, metrics to track execution, like remediation time or review completion rates. The important alignment point is that metrics should match the policy's intent and the organization's RA, because measuring the wrong thing can drive the wrong behavior. If people are measured only on speed, they may bypass controls, and if they are measured only on compliance completion, they may produce paperwork rather than outcomes. Accountability means metrics lead to action, such as escalating repeated failures, allocating resources to fix systemic issues, or updating baselines to reduce drift. It also means metrics are reviewed on a cadence, because a metric that nobody looks at is not a control. When measurement and review are built into policy governance, the policy becomes a living practice rather than a static statement. Aligning policy with RA also requires recognizing that risk acceptance is not the same as exception approval, even though beginners often blend them together. An exception is a temporary deviation from a requirement, while risk acceptance is the decision to live with a risk because the cost or feasibility of mitigation is not worth it given the organization's goals and constraints. Risk acceptance decisions should be explicit, documented, and owned by appropriate leaders because they represent choices about what harm the organization is willing to tolerate. If risk acceptance happens informally, it becomes a hidden policy rewrite, and the organization may not realize how far it has drifted from its stated commitments. A disciplined program ties risk acceptance to accountability mechanisms, ensuring that acceptance decisions have clear owners, clear rationale, and clear review timelines. This is also where governance, risk, and compliance, GRC, thinking matters, because GRC is about aligning governance decisions with risk reality and compliance expectations in a way that remains coherent over time. Even for a beginner, the key idea is that risk acceptance is a leadership decision, not a quiet workaround, and aligning policy means defining how those decisions are made and recorded. When risk acceptance is handled openly, policy remains credible because the organization can explain why a deviation exists rather than pretending it does not. Another important alignment concept is proportionality, because policies that apply the same strictness everywhere tend to either overburden low-risk areas or underprotect high-risk areas. Proportionality means the strength of requirements, the rigor of exception handling, and the intensity of accountability match the impact if something goes wrong. If a system processes highly sensitive data or controls critical business operations, policies should be stricter, exceptions should require stronger justification, and accountability should be tighter. If a system is low impact, policies can allow more flexibility and lighter processes while still maintaining basic hygiene. The alignment challenge is writing policy language that supports proportionality without becoming confusing, which often means defining categories of systems and data and tying requirements to those categories. Beginners sometimes assume categorization is bureaucratic, but it is actually a way to make security sustainable by focusing effort where it matters most. Proportionality also makes policy easier to follow because teams can see why the rules differ and how to determine which rules apply. When proportionality is explicit, auditors also have an easier time understanding the logic of controls, because the organization can show that stricter controls are applied where the impact is higher. This reduces disputes and reduces the temptation to treat policy as arbitrary. Exceptions and accountability also interact in a way that can either strengthen or weaken policy, depending on how the organization handles visibility. An exception process that is transparent creates learning because it shows where requirements are hard to meet and why. A hidden exception process creates risk because deviations spread quietly and teams copy each other's shortcuts. Accountability mechanisms should therefore include visibility, such as tracking active exceptions, reviewing them on a cadence, and ensuring they expire or are renewed with updated evidence. Visibility also includes ensuring that compensating controls are actually in place, because a compensating control that exists only on paper is not a real risk reduction. A common failure is approving exceptions in a rush and then never revisiting them, which turns temporary deviation into permanent posture. Another failure is allowing exceptions to accumulate without analyzing patterns, which misses the opportunity to improve policy, improve baselines, or improve tooling. Alignment means exceptions become a managed portfolio of risk decisions rather than a pile of forgotten approvals. When this is done well, the organization gains agility because it can handle special cases without sacrificing integrity. That combination of flexibility and control is what policy alignment is supposed to achieve. Policy alignment also requires building a feedback loop between policy, standards, baselines, and real-world operations, because policy does not live alone. If teams repeatedly request exceptions, that might mean the baseline configuration is too hard to adopt, or the standard needs refinement, or training and guidance are missing. If metrics show repeated drift in a specific control area, that might mean automated checks are needed, or ownership is unclear, or a dependency is failing. When leaders use these signals to adjust the system, policy becomes more realistic and more effective over time. A beginner might expect policy to be perfect when published, but mature governance expects learning and controlled evolution. The key is that changes should be deliberate and documented, not accidental and invisible. This is where policy review cadence matters, because periodic review provides a structured moment to reassess whether RA has changed, whether exceptions are trending, and whether accountability mechanisms are producing consistent outcomes. A policy that never changes may become misaligned as the business evolves, while a policy that changes constantly may lose credibility and confuse teams. Alignment is the practice of changing policy at the right pace, driven by evidence and risk decisions. It also helps to acknowledge that alignment is partly a communication challenge, because people follow what they understand and they resist what feels arbitrary. If the organization claims a conservative RA but routinely approves broad exceptions, people will conclude that the policy is theater. If the organization claims a high tolerance for risk but writes strict policies that block normal work, people will conclude that leadership does not understand reality. A leader-aligned approach communicates the why behind requirements, especially for high-impact controls, and it communicates how exceptions work so people are not tempted to bypass. It also communicates accountability clearly so people know where to go for decisions and how to raise concerns. Communication is not a soft extra. It is part of the control system because confusion creates inconsistent behavior, and inconsistent behavior creates risk. When policies are aligned, communication becomes simpler because the story is coherent. The organization has chosen a certain tolerance for risk. The policy reflects that tolerance. Exceptions are managed openly when reality requires it, and accountability mechanisms ensure the policy remains true over time. That coherence builds trust, and trust increases compliance because people believe the program is fair and stable. In security governance, fairness and stability are powerful controls because they reduce the incentive to work around the system. As we close, aligning policy with our exceptions, and accountability mechanisms is what turns a policy from a document into a predictable operating practice that survives deadlines and change. Risk appetite alignment ensures that requirements match what the organization is truly willing to invest and tolerate, so the policy is strict where impact is high and flexible where it should be. Exception alignment ensures that deviations are handled transparently with compensating controls, ownership, and expiration, preventing shortcuts from becoming permanent hidden posture. Accountability alignment ensures that responsibilities, decision rights, and measurement routines exist so the policy is enforced consistently, drift is detected, and corrective action happens without drama. When these three alignments reinforce each other, the organization gains something rare: security rules that people actually follow and auditors can actually verify, because the rules fit reality and the governance keeps them honest. That is the outcome you should aim for as a security leader, because it reduces risk not by demanding perfection, but by creating disciplined, visible decision-making that holds up over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.